Today we are going to open a magical trunk which contains dusty treasures, antique laces and withered, leather-bound old fairy tales. Most of these stories have been entirely forgotten by our modern world, and their colours have been washed away by centuries. But as they are enchanted, any time we open the pages, they instantly reveal their magic and their secrets again. Those are all fairy tales. The first fairy tales ever published 1 century before Grimm, Andersen and all the other storytellers, at the end of the 17th century. They are not only the written version of legends and myths told near the fireplace after supper in a cottage for 1,000 years, as those gathered by the Grimm brothers. They are the obsession, the entertainment, the passion of an entire class of the society, who will wrap these stories in gold and silk. During 100 years, the time Sleeping Beauty slept, the fairy tale will reign in France in all its glory. Where reading them, do you ask? These fairy tales are not meant to be read and heard in the kitchen while preparing a soup or to help children sleeping. They are supposed to be read aloud, wearing an elegant evening gown, the boudoir or in the salon, under the candlelight of precious crystal candelabras, with the scent of amber or almond floating in the air among very well chosen guests.
Êtes-vous point effrayée, charmante biche, lui dit-elle, de passer la nuit ici? La biche leva les yeux vers le ciel et soupira. Mais, continua Giroflée, vous avez déjà parcouru une partie de cette vaste solitude. N'y a-t-il point de maisonnette, un charbonnier, un bûcheron, un ermitage? Pour le porter à la princesse, il en fut ravi et le remit entre leurs mains. La reine n'avait point parlé jusqu'alors à sa fille de ce qui se passait. Elle avait même défendu aux dames qui étaient auprès d'elle de lui rien dire de l'arrivée.
In 1690, Marie-Catherine le Jumel de Barneville, Baroness d'Aulnoy, publishes L'île de la Félicité as part of her novel Le Comte de Douglas, the very first fairy tale to be published. Isn't it fascinating that the first published fairy tale tells the story of a prince who travels in a kingdom where nobody never dies, and he finally has to choose between love and eternity and glory and mortality? A little reminder of Renaud and Armide, by the way, that Madame d'Aulnoy knew really well from the delivered Jerusalem. Why this fairy tale is so special? Well, for the very first time, the fairy tales will leave the oral tradition to be settled between the pages of a book. And among all those storytellers, Charles Perrault, Madame d'Aulnoy, Mademoiselle de la Force, Madame le Prince de Beaumont, Madame de Villeneuve, and those who will follow, only Charles Perrault will reveal where his stories come from. He said that a countless number of fathers, mothers, grandmothers, governors, and great friends who since 1,000 years have added improvements, details and embellishment and so many pleasant circumstances to these stories. All these storytellers belong to the countryside aristocracy. To gather these stories, they have spent time in kitchens near their children governesses, and they have decorated and embellished all this material. So all these authors will wrap these plain fairy tales with precious romantic laces. The fairies in the oral tradition belonged to the forest and the woods. They had an enchanted wand made of hazel tree and wears muddy wooden shoes. The fairies appearing in these new fairy tales are all glittering, living in castles made of the most unseen and rarest material. Like in The Yellow Dwarf, for example, by Madame d'Aulnoy, she tells us that the princess wears a gown of silver brocade, striped with a dozen rays of the sun, which had been bought at an enormous price. Because all these writers are aristocrats, and all the heroes are princes and princesses, and the memory of the feasts, balls, fireworks of Versailles and Vaux-le-Vicomte they have seen by themselves or heard of, discreetly appears in all their descriptions. These fairy tales are published for the court and for those who live around the court who understand all the hidden references. They will purposefully delete any detail which would betray their plebeian origin. Among the enormous production of fairy tales at the end of the 17th century, a writer stood apart, Marie-Catherine Le Jumel de Barneville, Baroness, known as la Comtesse d'Aulnoy. We will dive deeper into her life and her writings in another video. Madame d'Aulnoy cannot be compared to the other storytellers of her time, for many reasons: her style, her imagination, her writing, but also her life. Known as La Fée des Contes, the fairy tales fairy, she has written the most enchanted stories. Though her own life is stained with blood, it's hard to imagine she could have died beheaded Place de Grève, the execution square in Paris. Instead of that, she has let her lover, Monsieur de la Moisière, be executed and beheaded for her on December 13, 1669, with her mother's lover, while they were safely escaping in England and Spain. If the reader reads her fairy tales carefully, he will see a lot of details and reminders of her life and personal circumstances. She hated her husband in the real life, and this shows in some of her fairy tales, just like in The Benevolent Frog, for example. A husband who could go through all this in order to recover his wife must certainly have lived in the time of the fairies, and his proceedings sufficiently mark the epoch of my story. As the 18th century reaches its end, the train of fairy tales slowly disappears, but Le Chevalier de Maillard decides in 1785 to save and collect all the fairy tales written in the 17th and 18th century, but also all the 1001 Nights and few other stories written by foreigners. He calls his collection Le Cabinet des Fées, referring to Le Cabinet de Curiosité or the Curiosity Cabinet, imitating collectors of this time who save pieces, curiosities, shells, skeletons, pieces of forgotten worlds to put them in display behind glasses, cupboards and boxes. Le Chevalier de Maillard knows nobody writes and publishes fairy tales anymore. So he decides to save them from oblivion and publishes 41 volumes between 1785 and 1788. This is also the memory of a world which no longer exists, the crossing of two worlds, Versailles and the countryside. And in 1789, the Revolution settles new rules and a new world. And in France, fairy tales, princesses, princes, castles and enchanted worlds disappear forever.